So, of course, I'd like to start by saying thank you, everyone, for joining. My name is Cody Armstrong, and today we're talking about measure, mass properties, and a few other little details that I thought I'd throw in that are kind of tying into those two things. And this is going to be a very short webinar. This is very simple stuff to explain, but I do want to take the time to explain it in as much detail as I can, because I think this is one of the more common questions that we get. How do I measure? How do I tell how much something weighs? So, as I always say with these webinars, I really encourage you to ask any questions that you'd like. There's a questions dialog in the GoToWebinar control panel. Feel free to ask any question, especially today. This is going to be a short webinar. I'll do my best to answer any questions that you have, and I'll make sure to stick around and even after the webinar and get to all of them. So measure, mass properties, and a few other little things tied in with that. All right, so the agenda real quickly here. First thing, introduce measure and mass properties. I think that's the big thing. How to find it, how to use it. Discuss where they're used. So where would you need a certain measurement, or how would you go about applying a material to get the mass? And then, of course, I'm going to get into all the details of how this is done in Onshape, and that's going to be the meat of it. Of course, answer any questions that you have. There's a questions dialog, again, in the GoToWebinar control panel. Feel free to ask any question, and I'll do my best to answer them as we're going through things here. All right, so without further ado, let's dig right into it. Now, I think, I really wanted to start this with the most common question that we get. This is by far, I would say, top 5. One of the more common questions that we get is, where is the measure command? So this is one of the first things. If you had to take away one thing from this webinar, it's that there is not a button or an icon or something to click on for measure, right? At least to activate measure. So if you want to measure something, just click on the thing that you want to measure. And I think that's the big message. If you had to take away one thing from this webinar, it would be there's not a button that you're going to go click on first to enable measure, right? So not a button, not an icon in the toolbar. It's not something that you're going to find in it. You just simply click on the thing that you want to measure. So measure is always on, and you select the thing that you want to measure. Now, that sounds really simple, but what about more complex measurements, right? Where maybe I want a delta value between 2 points, or I want the angle between 2 faces, or something to that effect. And it's important to point out, it doesn't really matter what the measurement is. You're going to select those entities, and the measurement will appear in the bottom, should say right corner, right? So let me fix that briefly here. So in the bottom right corner, we should have the measure. Just keep in mind, you don't need to activate it. It's not something that you need to bring up separately beforehand. So that's the first thing, probably one of the most important things I would stress to all those new users out there. That, one of the first questions I get asked is, I've imported a model. How do I tell what diameter this hole is? Right. So measure is going to be one of the first things that you're going to use as a new user, and it's important to understand how it works. And I'm going to give you an example of this in just a second, so bear with me. But that's the key thing. It's not a command in the interface. You simply select the thing that you want to measure, and the measurement will appear in the bottom right corner. Right. Now, what about mass? That's the next natural question is, well, how do I tell how much something weighs? Or maybe how do I tell how much my entire assembly weighs? Or, how do I tell how much these combinations of parts weigh? And the answer, and it's a very important step in the process, is in order to obtain a meaningful number for mass, you need to assign a material. In fact, if you select a whole bunch of parts, or you select an assembly, and one of the parts does not have a material assigned, you'll get a notice in mass properties telling you one or more parts does not have materials assigned. So it's a very important step if you're trying to figure out how much your design weighs, of course, to apply a material. Now, I'm going to go through applying a material in a second. It's one question that gets commonly asked is there a way for me to create my own material according to my own density specs or whatever it may be? And the answer is today, no. We don't have that capability as of today, but I will say that that's something that we're looking very closely at. So we realize there are a lot of users out there who want to input their own materials. Now, with that being said, there is a very long list of materials available by default to everyone. So just keep in mind that, we may not have the exact spec if you have one of those, really custom types of material configurations, or you're the type that goes in and specifically orders based on a certain spec of material, we have something that's probably very, very close, right? If it's not exactly what you're using. So that's a quick aside on materials. I'm going to go into assigning materials in just a second. But the big thing is, if you want to know how much something weighs, right? Select the parts, or assembly, and you'll see the mass properties icon in the bottom right corner. It's in the same location as measure, right? So just keep in mind, whether it's mass you're looking for or measure that you're looking for, it's in the same place in that bottom right corner of Onshape. And I put it here wrong again. Forgive me, bottom left corner. So again, bottom right corner, anywhere that you select. So if I select a circle, for instance, I'm going to get a radius value for the bottom right corner. If I select two faces, I'm going to get the angle or the distance between them in the bottom right corner. So whether it's mass, whether it's a measurement, both of those things are going to appear in that bottom right corner. All right, so that's a quick aside on mass. Keep in mind, again, you must assign a material and then either select a part, a number of parts, or even an assembly, and you'll see the mass properties icon in the bottom right corner. Okay? All right, so let's get into it. Now, one last slide for you before I get into the actual measurements and such is there are other questions associated with mass, things like center of gravity or center of mass, right, or moments of inertia. And all of these things, including volume and surface area, are also inside of that mass properties dialog. So whether you're looking for the weight, the volume, the surface area, the moments of inertia, the center of gravity, it's all within that one dialog. Question: when will there be more material available? The list is very limited right now. SolidWorks has much more. We're definitely aware of that. It's a very high priority for us in terms of capabilities. So we're certainly aware that the need, and then many users have expressed that. And also, if you haven't already, definitely use the, under the help menu, the feedback tool, or you can go to the forums and use an improvement request just to allow us to gauge the importance of that. We realize that it needs to be done. It's just a matter of prioritizing. So I will say that that's something that's very, very high on our list of priorities. Very similar, by the way, to customization of keyboard shortcuts. We want the user to be able to log in on any device and have their custom materials, their custom keyboard shortcuts, and those are just things we can't do today. All right, so center of mass, moments of inertia, those are also within that mass properties dialog. Now, the thing that I always like to mention here is in the case of moments of inertia, remember that it's always dependent on a centroid, which may not necessarily be what you're looking for. So what I would say is, if you're looking for accurate moments of inertia based on a certain piece of geometry or reference on your geometry, you can use a mate connector to establish that, sometimes referred to as a local coordinate system, but essentially it just allows you to define, from this point I want you to calculate those references, those moments of inertia. So you can use a mate connector and its defaults, orientations, X, Y, and Z, as a reference for defining moments of inertia. And as I mentioned before, volume, surface area are also within this mass properties. All right, so enough slides. Let's get into Onshape. Now, as I mentioned before, it's going to be very short. This is easy stuff to show, but I wanted to sit down and get into as much detail on these things as I can, because I think, again, this is a very common workflow, especially for those new users out there. All right, so let's start simple. How do I measure? Right? Let's say that I wanted the measurement of a hole, for instance. Right? How do I know what that value is, what the size of that hole is? So again, I'm not pre-selecting any commands. There's nothing in the toolbar to click first. You click, in this case, the edge of the hole, and in the bottom right corner, you'll see the measurement pop up. So again, bottom right corner, just select the geometry that you want to measure. It doesn't matter what it is, whether it's a diameter, or you want to measure the length of a line, or the distance between two faces, all of those things. The process is the same. Select the entities, look in the bottom right corner. All right, so that's a simple one, right? I want to tell the diameter of a hole. Just left click, and it appears in that bottom right corner. But what if I wanted, the distance between two faces? All right, so left click, you'll see parallel distance, 73 millimeters. Now, one thing that I always like to mention is if you do mouse over that number, you're going to see an actual, in this case, dotted line going between the measurements. So it's showing you this is what the measurement is between. Now, with two parallel faces, that's very easy, right? It's just one line for the parallel distance, 73 millimeters. But when you have more complicated scenarios, it may be the delta values that you're looking for. For instance, if I click on a point, right, it will give me just the coordinates of that point. But if I click on a second point, it will give me the minimum distance. And if I expand it, it will give me those delta values as well, right? So if you're just looking for, what's the distance from this point to this point, click the 2 points and you have your minimum distance. But if you're looking for actual delta values between the 2 points, then you can expand out, just left click the actual measurement, and you'll get those values here, right? So just keep in mind, and it doesn't really matter. For instance, another good example is, what if I wanted to know the angle between two faces? If I left click a face, right, left click a face, I get the angle between them. Because they're not parallel, of course, it's going to give me the angle value rather than the parallel minimum distance. So just another example, again, just left click the geometry. If you want measurements between two things, left click two things, right? Same goes for, if I just wanted the length of an edge, for example, I can left click an edge and it's going to give me the length. So again, I can't stress this enough, just select the geometry, whatever it is that you're trying to measure, and it should appear in that bottom right corner. Does dialog indicate through versus threaded holes with specs? No. In this case, it's just a measurement of the hole diameter. So it's not going to tell you this hole was created using hole feature and it's a 1/2-13 hole. No, it's going to give you, the pitch circle diameter because that's what the hole feature would create. I guess that's something that if you're really looking for, the hole feature specific information, definitely let us know. I could see definitely why that would be useful. As of today, it's just a strict measurement of the hole diameter, right? So, question: can I export the mass properties to Excel or another program? No, not as of today, and there's no way as of today to get it into the bill of materials yet. That's something that we're very aware of and actively working on. So there's no way to tie in the mass as of today with like a property that you could then go back and forth with. A good question. How do I measure the center of two holes? Again, left click. You're going to by default get the minimum, but you will have a center distance here too. So again, the question is, how do I get the distance between two holes? Very common scenario. Left click. By default, with any measurement, you're going to get the minimum distance, which is not center to center. But if I expand out, I can see center distance. All right. So that's center to center of the holes. So you will have to expand to see that center distance. By default, you're going to get the minimum. All right, so that is a simple intro into the measure command, and it doesn't matter whether you're using imported geometry. Maybe you've just imported this model or you've modeled it natively inside of Onshape. That really doesn't make a difference. Measure will work all the same in either scenario. All right, so now let's get into mass. And mass is definitely a different discussion. When you want to get into mass, the important thing to keep in mind, the thing I want to stress here is the material must be defined. Without that, you're going to run into a little dialogue that tells you do not have all materials defined, the numbers won't make sense. So just keep in mind, material defining is the prerequisite to mass properties. All right, so how do I assign a material? I think that's the first question. I want to know how much this overall thing weighs. How do I go through and assign the material? The first thing I want to stress is this must be done in the part studio, not the assembly, right? So I'm going to jump back to the part studio, and then I can apply my materials. Now, in this example, I've already done a lot of it. I didn't want to walk you through doing it 9 or 10 times, but I do have a part here that is materials not defined. So as I mentioned before, the first step is defining that material. Now, I do want to mention that if you don't do this, it's going to tell you. So just keep in mind, it's not as though it's just going to be blank. It's going to say no material defined. So let's do this. I'm going to right click the motor mounting flange. I'm going to say assign material, right? It's going to bring up the material dialog where I can choose from a list, right? So if I scroll down here, pretty long list of materials. Okay. Of course, we recognize the need to add more. There's always going to be a need to add more. That's something we're certainly working on. Now, the question is, do I need to scroll through that list? Is there a fast way to get through it? And the answer is yes. If you just start typing in the material box here, it's going to filter. And I can say aluminum 6061. I'll hit the green check. And now I've defined my material, right? So that is the very important first step to defining or figuring out the mass, right? Now, the question is, once you've done that, once I've assigned my material, how do I know how much it weighs? How do I tell the mass? And it's in the same location as measure. The key thing, though, is you must select the thing that you want to weigh first. So let's say that I want to know how much this motor mounting flange weighs. I left click to select it. That's the first step before I can determine the mass. And then you'll see in the bottom right corner, display mass properties. Right? So if I left click this will bring up the mass properties dialog. Now, there are a few things that I want to mention here. First off, a lot of these calculations, there is some degree of tolerance to them, and you can see that with show calculation variance. Right? Now, the other thing I like to stress is this is going to be truncated based on the length of display units. So you'll see here 0.993 pounds, but if I mouse over it, you can see the real value, which is 7-8 decimal places past. So again, if you want to see the real value, just mouse over the geometry. So you have mass, volume, surface area, center of mass, and moments of inertia. Now, as I mentioned before, the moments of inertia is based on the centroid of the part, the default, and that may not necessarily be what you're looking for to define your moments of inertia by. So you can define a reference frame for a moment of inertia. You can see I have a mate connector here. Mate connector is just a simple way to define this is the orientation and position I want you to reference the moments of inertia by. Right? So just keep in mind that is an option. You can define that for your moments of inertia. Otherwise, it would be using the centroid. Now, this is just for a single part, of course. I selected the motor mount flange, and I clicked on mass properties, right? And that brings me up to the mass and all the details for just that one part. Now, the natural question is, well, what if I wanted to weigh several parts, right? Or what if I wanted to weigh an entire assembly? And the process is very much the same. Instead of selecting one part, you would be selecting a number of parts, or you would be selecting an assembly. But the process of bringing them in, taking the actual mass is the same. It's always that mass properties dialog in the bottom right corner. So let's go to an assembly here. Bear with me for a second. Quick questions. Can I add the value of mass properties for commercial components? And this is a very good question, another very common question. I think, unfortunately, the answer is no. There's no way today to input a mass. We recognize that is a very important thing. So just keep in mind, when you're doing something like importing parts, there's no way today to say this weighs X and override whatever material settings that you've defined. question. Your slide said to select a part from the parts list or feature list. I don't get a mass properties icon when selecting a part from the feature list. No, when you select you're not selecting a part from the feature list. Maybe we're just getting hung up on the details of it. But when I say parts list, I'm referring to below the features here. So you can see it says parts 9, and I have motor mounting flange and O-ring and oil seal. I'm referring to selecting it from here. You're not selecting an individual feature. So when I'm referring to parts list, I'm just referring to the bottom half of the feature list, really. Right. All right. So as I mentioned before, the next question is, okay, I've gone through the effort of defining the material for all of these parts. They come from all these different part studios. How do I tell the total weight of the assembly? And as I mentioned before, it's very similar to just measuring one part. If I wanted to measure or weigh one part, I could left click it, and you'll see here display mass properties, right? Well, the process is the same if you want to weigh all the parts. I could just shift select or control select a whole series of parts, right? Go back, display mass properties, right? So now I've selected every part in this assembly and clicked mass properties, and you can see it's just over 7 pounds, 7.7 pounds. So again, it doesn't matter if it's one part, a couple parts, the entire assembly. Let's say that this, if I were to drop this into another top level assembly, then you could just select the assembly from the instance list, measure properties or mass properties, right? So same exact process. It's just a matter of selecting the thing that you want to measure or figure out the mass or volume or surface area of. So just keep in mind, again, mass properties, just select the parts or assembly that you want to display the mass properties of. Go to that bottom right corner, click that icon, and you will have it. Right. Now, I should mention this just briefly. The process is really the same on mobile. So a commonly asked question is, can you measure on mobile? And the answer is yes. Same exact process. In fact, you'll see the same icon. So just tap the part. You'll see that mass properties icon appear where you can get this same information. The same thing goes for measure, by the way. Question: other than the XYZ coordinates, is there any on-screen representation of the center of mass, perhaps one that can be used in a drawing? No. As of today, no. But that is something I've said this a few times, I realize, but we definitely know that it's important. So we're working on it. The ability to not necessarily reference, but see visually the center of mass is something that many users have requested. So, right, as of today, as you mentioned, it's just a value with respect to the origin. It's an XYZ coordinate. All right, so that is what I had for you today. Again, wanted to mention, it doesn't matter what you're trying to do, whether you're measuring, whether you're figuring out the mass, all of those things are in that bottom right corner. Okay, and volume, surface area, I didn't mention that as well, but just keep in mind, bottom right corner. If I had to take anything take away from this webinar, it's the bottom right corner is where you'll find measure, mass, and all that other info. Just a matter of selecting the thing that you're trying to measure or weigh first. All right, so that is what I had planned. A question: is it the first webinar of any series? No, we do regular webinars normally twice a week, and we do our best to post them on our YouTube channel. We also send out a link to a recording to anyone who registered. So, we do webinars roughly twice a week. All right, everyone. That is just about it. I am going to stick around and answer any questions. So just keep in mind, I will be around to answer any questions that you have. But that's what I had planned. I want to say thank you, everyone, and have a good day.